An ancient burial cloth rests in a cathedral in Turin. The evidence of who was laid in it may take you by surprise.
This shroud is called the Shroud of Turin because it has been kept in the royal chapel of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin for hundreds of years. Turin is a large city nestled up against the mountains in the northwest of Italy. The shroud is a 14-foot long piece of linen. The linen has a rather special herringbone weave, as we see here. It is believed that it was wrapped around Jesus, as we see here in this painting. Underneath and then back over the top. That painting is called The Descent from the Cross, painted by Giovanni Battista della Rovere, who lived around 1561 to 1627. In his book, Ian Wilson has collected documentary evidence of the shroud's history back to early times. Some of this I will share with you today. What impresses me is that Ian Wilson began his study as an agnostic and became a Christian as a result of his years of research on the shroud. I guess you may be wondering what the shroud looks like. Here we see an official photograph of the shroud taken in 1931 by Giuseppe Enri. In the next slide I have artificially increased the contrast so that you can see more clearly what it is in this rather poor lighting. You will see that it shows two faint head-to-head images of the body of a man. Here's the back image here and the front image here on the left. This corresponds to what the artist drew in the picture we saw, and the shroud was his inspiration, as we see here in this more complete view of his painting. You'll see that angels are shown holding the shroud up here. Coming back to the shroud itself, we can see that there are other things more noticeable on the shroud than the body images. Most noticeable are the burn marks, here, 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 etc. There are a series of these resulting from the way that the shroud was folded when fire broke out in 1532 in the chapel where the shroud was kept. The silver casket in which the shroud was housed partially melted and collapsed, burning holes in the shroud. The shroud was repaired and patches were sewn over the burn holes, as we see here. Thankfully, there was very little damage done to the main areas of the shroud image, which was all up the centre here. There are other small burn holes that happened at some earlier time when the shroud was folded differently, and we'll be mentioning these later. As well as the burn marks, there are water stains from an earlier time when the shroud was folded differently again. We can see them more clearly as the contrast is increased again. The shroud has had many miraculous escapes from destruction, as we will see later. But what is of most interest to us are the two body images. To look at these more closely, we will divide the picture in half and turn the two halves into the vertical position, as we see here. If this were the actual burial shroud of Christ, what would these marks be here? I don't know if you can see them very clearly. Up on the forehead, up in the hair, there are some darkish marks. What would they be? blood from the crown of thorns piercing his head. And what would these marks be here in the wrist and down in the feet here? Yes, blood from where the nails went through the feet and hands. You will recall that a spear was thrust into Jesus' side, and there's a large flow of blood up there corresponding to that. If we look more closely at the back, we'll see that it is covered with scourge marks from the shoulders right down to the calves of the legs. But of course, it's just a painting. At least that's what I first thought. What began to change my mind was the face, which we see here enlarged and with slightly less contrast. Nothing remarkable about that, you might say, and you can see there the blood marks there and there. It's a rather poor painting of a face. And in case you're wondering, these dark lines across here are fold marks from when the cloth was folded at an early time. But in 1898, a man by the name of Secundo Pia, shown here, took the first photograph of the shroud. Photography had only recently been invented. Imagine the surprise of Pia when he later developed the photo with his camera. It was on a glass plate, and this is what he saw. Instead of the rather strange ghostly figure on the shroud, Pia found a rather normal-looking face pictured on his glass plate. Pia was so surprised that he almost dropped it, we're told. It is not so long ago that we all had to put films in our cameras to take a picture. We then took the film to a place to get developed. First it was a black and white film, and later it was a colour film, but the principle was the same. First the film was developed, and then the film was printed, which involved taking a picture of the film. What was on the film was a negative. Did you ever try recognising someone's face in the negative to decide which photo to get a print of? It's pretty difficult. The negative looks so strange. For example, do you recognise this man? Ah, very good. There he is. A bit easier to recognise that way. So Pia, when he was developing the first picture of the shroud, thought it was going to be a negative and that he would have to make a print of it to get the picture of the shroud he was looking for. But he found he already had the print, the positive. He did not have to go through the second step. This showed clearly that the image on the shroud was actually a negative. This is what convinced me, and it has convinced many others, that the Shroud of Turin was not a painting. How would an artist know how to paint a negative when he'd never seen one? And even if he did know, why would he do it when he did not know that photography would be invented to reveal his genius? Just not feasible. But there is more. On February 19, 1976, 5 scientists got together to analyse the shroud photographs using an image analyzer designed for NASA's space program. This image analyzer, called a VP8, has the ability to transform images into an apparent three-dimensional picture. With radar imaging, the closer the object is to the radar, the brighter the object appears to be. The VP8 analyzer transforms this extra brightness into extra height. It was thus able to visualise ridges, mountains and valleys on the far side of the Moon and on other planets. Using this same instrument on the Shroud of Turin photos showed similar results. This image here is green because that was the colour of the monitor screen of the analyzer. Can you see that the nose stands out, the ridges of the eyebrows stand out, the moustache and the beard stand out in a three-dimensional way. 2 years earlier, a Frenchman, Paul Gastineau, produced a three-dimensional picture using a different technique. And in 2000, Guareschi produced this picture using a different method again. Using the same method, he produced these three-dimensional pictures of the front and back images of the shroud. You can see how they really stand out in three-dimensional relief. An ordinary photograph or painting does not behave this way. Here we see the difference between the way an ordinary photo and the shroud image respond under Guareschi's treatment. Here we see a lady holding the negative shroud image, and here under Guareschi's treatment we get a three-dimensional effect here, but not that happening with the picture of the lady. It is clear that the shroud image has three-dimensional information, but it was the green BP8 image first seen in 1976 that originally caught the attention of scientists and galvanised them into action. As a result, in 1978, a group of 31 scientists got together and formed the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP as it became known. A group of them were eventually allowed full access to the shroud. They brought an immense amount of scientific equipment with them. Here they are, unloading the truck. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, each day, for 5 days with the shroud, gathering data. They were particularly interested in looking at the back of the shroud. They were looking to see if the image on the front of the cloth could also be seen from the back of it, but it could not be seen. There was no sign of it, as we'll see later on. Here they are laying out the shroud and making sure there are no wrinkles. Small magnets were used to attach the shroud to the support frame. Once fixed in place, the table could be rotated into the vertical position. Notice how faint the body images are. I doubt if you can see them at all. The shroud was photographed using X-rays, infrared and ultraviolet light. It was examined with a microscope and photomicrographs were taken. Of course, ordinary colour pictures were taken. Here we see Barry Schwartz, one of the 2 official photographers on the team, setting up his camera. At least 30 scientific papers were published as a result of this work. What did they find? Firstly, as we have seen, they found that the image was only on the front surface of the cloth. We can see this in this photo of the shroud taken by transmitted light. That is, light shone through from the back. The body image has disappeared. If we brighten the picture somewhat, it still cannot be seen. The blood stains are clearly visible on the wrist and arms and feet. There's a wrist stain, the arms, the feet down here, and the blood stain there by the side. Likewise, the water stains are clearly visible, but the body image is nowhere to be seen. You can see the water stains very clearly there and there. But if the image had been a painting, it would have been visible under transmitted light, but it wasn't there. This is a photo micrograph from the area of the bridge, area of the bridge of the nose. It shows how each linen thread is made up of a large bundle of linen fibres. Some of the fibres are coloured and some are not, and only the top layers of fibres are coloured in this way. Clearly there is no sign of any paint or other colouring material. This came as quite a surprise to many of the Stirp scientists. They thought that they would find evidence of paint on the shroud and would be able to pack up and go home after half an hour, but they did not. They found no evidence of paint or any other colouring material. Secondly, they found that the blood was real blood. This colour picture of the facial image shows that the blood is the red colour of blood. I don't know if you can see that very clearly. This photo micrograph of a scourge mark on the image of the back shows numerous small blood stains. You can see spots here, here, here. The red colour can also be seen on this picture of a clot of blood lifted off the shroud with sticky tape. And on this photomicrograph of a blood fleck alongside a linen fibre. You can see that the linen fibre has hollow colourless centre. Chemical tests were done on some of the blood lifted off the shroud. It was found to be real blood with bilirubin, etc. It had the colour spectrum of blood. It was also found to have DNA present, but it has not been sequenced yet. As mentioned earlier, one of the two official photographers on the team was Barry Schwartz. Amazingly, he was a Jew. Only 2 years ago, in 2012, he wrote of his experience. Here is a recent photo of him. He writes as follows: "Truthfully, I had been a skeptic since the first day I was approached by Don Navan to join the Stirp team in late 1976. Right from the beginning, I believed the shroud was most likely painted. Not only that, but I felt uncomfortable because I was Jewish. I felt uncomfortable because I thought it might become a Christian project. I actually tried to quit twice, but in the end I didn't. When I got to Turin, I expected we would find paint and pigment immediately. I thought that would be the end of it. Yet within the first hour of our examination, I knew it was not painted. Yet 18 years later, he was still not convinced that the shroud was genuine. One day he was speaking to Professor Alan Adler, pictured here examining slide samples taken from the shroud. Barry Schwartz says, "When the shroud was first put before us in 1978, Vern Miller and I stood side by side over the cloth, and we looked very closely at some of the dense red bloodstains found there. We both believed that old blood was supposed to turn black or brown over time. If these stains were that old, why were they still red?" Now, 18 years later, Adler gave me the answer. He explained that extended torture, like that suffered by the man on the shroud, causes the breakdown of the red blood cells and the flooding of bilirubin into the bloodstream. Apparently, blood of that nature will remain red forever. There was only one answer possible about the shroud. It had to be authentic. It was really something of a shock, he said. The results of the scientific investigation of the Shroud of Turin by the Stirp team eventually led the authorities in 1988 to allow a radiocarbon dating to be made. The radiocarbon date that came back was somewhat of a bombshell. It dated the shroud to between 1260 and 3090 AD. If that was the true date, It could not possibly be the burial shroud of Christ. As a result, many attempts were made to show how the shroud could have been produced in medieval times, all of them unsuccessful. Among these attempts was a documentary on the ABC recently that some of you may have seen, trying to show how Leonardo da Vinci did it with rudimentary photography. However, the first exhibitions of the shroud took place around 1355 in France, and Leonardo da Vinci was an Italian born in 1452, almost 100 years later. He could not possibly have done it. Moreover, shroud scientists were certain that they had evidence which took the shroud back to much earlier times. They therefore began to look more closely at the radiocarbon dates and the samples that were taken. You will see in this photograph of the shroud by Henry that there are two missing corners, over here and here. This is because samples of the shroud were given to people in earlier times. One of them was given to the Pope. It is this left corner that is of interest to us. It was from alongside this missing corner that samples were taken for radiocarbon dating. Here we see this corner enlarged, and then we turn it around to show how the samples were taken. Here we see a strip being cut from the shroud. This slide shows how the samples were cut and then sent to different radiocarbon laboratories in Arizona, Oxford and Zurich. In 2011, Van Heelst published this statistical survey of the radiocarbon dates. It shows clearly that there is total disagreement between them. This shows the probability of the date being a particular date, here's the dates down here, for Arizona and for Oxford. And there's quite a space between them where there's no probability at all of the date being there. Total disagreement between the two datings. What does this mean? It means that the area from which the samples were taken was not uniform. It was from a corner where there had clearly been damage at one time. You can see damage here and here, and this discoloration here. It had probably been subject to what is called invisible mending. The difference in colour in the sample area is obvious. Here we have the same area photographed by transmitted light. A strip of darker material runs horizontally through the middle and does not continue in the backing cloth. Can you see that? There's a big marked difference there. This seems to be clear evidence of mending having taken place. Mending, of course, would have been with more modern material and hence would invalidate any radiocarbon date based upon it. The radiocarbon date is clearly not a reliable guide, and we are free to examine the history of the shroud back to earlier times, which we will now do. The modern history of the shroud begins with Geoffroy de Charny, a French knight of very high reputation. Here we see him facing off the English king, Edward III. Notice that de Charny is wearing his coat of arms colours, and he's carrying the banner there with that same coat of arms. We'll notice the significance of this shortly. De Charny was born around 1300 and died in the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. He married Jean de Vergy around 1352, 3 to 4 years before he was killed. Shortly after marrying Jean de Vergy, Geoffroy Charny built a church, the wooden precursor of this brick one. in his hometown of Leary, which you see here in this map. And there the shroud was exhibited on special occasions for a number of years. The shroud at this time was called the Shroud of Leary. Here we have a pilgrim badge. Pilgrim badges were frequently worn by pilgrims at this time to show that they had been on a particular pilgrimage. They were then frequently thrown into rivers for good luck. This is where this badge was found, in the Seine River, under the Porte-Change Bridge in Paris. Notice that on this pilgrim badge we have the shroud picture. Here is the front image, here is the back image of the shroud. Also, you'll notice very clearly the herringbone weave of the shroud is pictured there. What is of great interest to us is the two coats of arms that are shown on this pilgrim badge. On the left is the coat of arms of Geoffrey de Charny, and on the right is the coat of arms of Jean de Bergy, up here, same as this one. The fact that both of these coats of arms are shown prominently on the pilgrim badge indicates that the pilgrimage took place during the time of their marriage, that is between 1352 and 1356, when de Charny died. Some 40 years later, a certain bishop, Pierre II Diakis, became jealous of the shroud being at Leary. He wanted it in his own cathedral, the Cathedral of Troyes, for the shroud was a great revenue raiser. When he could not get it, he claimed that the shroud was a fake. By that time, none of the de Charny family could answer this charge. Geoffrey de Charny had long since been dead, and his wife Jean de Bergy had possibly died also. Their son Geoffrey de Charny II was only an infant when the shroud was first exhibited at Leary, and possibly did not know its origin also. So for quite some time the shroud was regarded as a medieval fake. In view of the recent scientific evidence that it is not a fake, historians have been tracing its history. One important piece of evidence is the Pray manuscript from Hungary. It has nothing to do with prayer. It is named after Georgi Pray, who discovered it in 1770. The manuscript contains several pictures of Christ. This one depicts the burial of Jesus. The upper panel shows Christ exactly as he is on the shroud. He's naked, his two arms are crossed. I don't know if you noticed before, but on the shroud only the four fingers are showing, there are no thumbs. The bottom picture shows the angel on the left saying to the woman on Sunday morning, "He is not here, he is risen." On the bench where he lay, which is marked with red crosses, we have the two linen cloths, the shroud and the napkin that was round his head. If you look more closely at the representation of the shroud, you will see that there are these round holes marked in it. They are in an L-shaped pattern, exactly as on the shroud. Here and here. This is clear evidence that around AD 1195, a Hungarian artist was intimately acquainted with the details of the shroud. We will now go back a little further in time to AD 1993. At that time, Constantinople was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Emperor Romanus was getting a bit old, decided that he would do something significant by which he could be remembered. We all like to try and do that, I think. He hit upon an ingenious plan. He knew that the city of Edessa had something very precious. Pilgrims from all over the empire were travelling to Edessa to see a special picture of Christ. That's where Edessa is. This picture of Christ was called the image of Edessa. These pilgrims brought a considerable income to the city, and the image had been credited with great power, at one time saving the city of Edessa from the Persian army. Why shouldn't the pilgrims be coming to Constantinople instead of bringing their wealth to Edessa? Why shouldn't Constantinople have the protection offered by this wonderful picture? So Romanus decided to send his general John Curcuus to fetch it. This was no simple matter. Curcuus had to travel deep into Muslim territory, and the people of Edessa were not willing to give up their treasure. Curcuus could not easily take it by force, even if he could find it, because the city was well fortified. Massive walls protected Edessa. After a long siege, Curcuus was finally able to persuade the authorities in Edessa to part with their prized possession in exchange for 200 high-ranking officials who had been taken prisoner, 12,000 silver crowns, plus Edessa was guaranteed perpetual immunity from any further attack by the emperor. Eventually, after foiling 2 attempts to deceive him with mere copies of the image, Curcuus was finally able to take possession of the image of Edessa, as we see here depicted in this drawing by John Skylitzes, made around 1150 to 1250 AD. Notice that the cloth is shown as being quite long, agreeing with the dimensions of the shroud. The face on it is seen symbolically as leading up to greet the new owner. The face is clearly depicted as being in the middle of the cloth, which is just where it is on the shroud. The cloth bearing the image of Edessa was brought back to Constantinople and welcomed with great pomp and ceremony lasting several days. During this time, a sermon was preached by Gregory Referendus, the archdeacon of the great cathedral Hagia Sophia, which means holy wisdom. Amazingly, the full text of this sermon has survived to this day and was translated into English in 2004. In this sermon, he mentions that the cloth from Edessa had on it blood from Christ's side. This clearly indicates that he had seen the full body image, not just a face. In AD 1204, the Fourth Crusade came to Constantinople. At first they were welcomed into the city. One of the Crusaders reported that every Friday in the church of Lacernae, the shroud in which our Lord had been wrapped could be seen standing upright, and the figure of Jesus could be seen on it. Sadly, there was a disagreement between the Crusaders and the rulers of Constantinople, and the Crusaders ended up sacking Constantinople. For a long while it was not known what has happened to the shroud at this time. However, we now know that it was first taken to Athens. The French Crusaders had their headquarters there. In a recently discovered document called the Cartularium Calenense, we read, "The Venetians appropriated the treasures of gold, silver and ivory, while the French did the same with the relics of the saints, and the most sacred of all, the linen in which our Lord Jesus was wrapped after his death and before his resurrection. We know that the sacred objects were preserved by their predators in Venice, in France and other places. the sacred linen in Athens. The person in charge in Athens was a Frenchman named Otho de la Roche, or de la Roche, I don't know, and he took the shroud back to France. The de la Roche family have long held the belief that the shroud had been in their possession, and they have this box to prove it. In 2010, Alessandro Piana took this photo of it. The label on top, this label up here, reads 13th century coffer in which was preserved in Ray Castle the Shroud of Christ brought by Otho de la Ray from Constantinople in 1206. He is called Otho de Ray on the label because he was married to Elizabeth de Ray and inherited her titles and lands, including the castle of Ray. Now, listen to this. Jean de Vergy, the wife of Geoffrey de Charny, was a direct descendant of Otho de la Roche, and it was only after Geoffrey's marriage to Jean that the shroud began to be exhibited at Leary. Clearly the shroud had passed down through the de Roche family to Jean de Vergy and hence to her husband Geoffrey de Charny. All this shows that the shroud we now know as the Shroud of Turin is the same cloth that was taken from Edessa to Constantinople in AD 993. But how did it come to be in Edessa? In the time of Christ, there was a king in Edessa named Agbar V. The church historian Eusebius tells us about the marvellous way that Agbar received Christianity. After the ascension of Jesus, Thomas sent Thaddeus, one of the 70 disciples, to Agbar at his invitation. Agbar was suffering an incurable disease and had heard of the fame of Jesus. He was healed by Thaddeus and became a devout Christian. Eusebius does not tell this story in his own words, but translates for us the Syriac documents from Edessa. I haven't read them all because it's too long. It is at the end of Book 1 of his ecclesiastical history. Although in this account there is no mention of a shroud or an image or likeness of Christ, it was certainly at Edessa in later years, and this is the most likely time for it to have come there. There is, in fact, a considerable body of tradition in the Eastern Church that the image of Edessa was brought to Edessa by Thaddeus on this occasion. One such example is this painting made in the 10th century and found at St. Catherine's Monastery, Mount Sinai. It shows King Agbar receiving the image of Edessa from Thaddeus. Assuming that the shroud of Jesus did reach Edessa at this early time, we can trace its history down through the years and marvel at the way God has protected it. It escaped the destruction when Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70 because it had already been taken to Edessa. It escaped destruction when Edessa reverted to paganism after the death of Agbar V. It was secretly hidden in a niche high in the walls above a gate of Edessa. When Christianity returned to Edessa in AD 177, the whereabouts of the shroud and even maybe its existence had been forgotten. It escaped several bad floods because it was high up in the wall. In AD 201, a Christian church was destroyed by a flood. In AD 303 there was another serious flood. In AD 525 there was a very disastrous flood. 30,000 people were killed. Several major churches were destroyed. To prevent this happening again, the River Dyson was rerouted and the walls had to be reconstructed. In the process, the shroud was discovered hidden in the niche above the gate. The shroud escaped 2 attacks by Persian kings. They did not enter the city. In AD 503, King Kavad came to the city and then withdrew. In AD 544, King Khosrow made a determined attack but was forced to withdraw. This time the city's protection was attributed to the newly rediscovered shroud. In AD 679, the shroud survived an earthquake which destroyed the famous Hagia Sophia Cathedral where the shroud was kept. Yes, there was a Hagia Sophia in Edessa and there was another one in Constantinople. The shroud was sent to Jerusalem while the cathedral was being rebuilt. In AD 723, a wave of iconoclasm, that is, destroying images and pictures, swept through Christianity, but it did not reach Edessa. If the shroud had been in Constantinople at that time, it would undoubtedly have been destroyed. In AD 944, the shroud survived the dangerous journey to Constantinople. In AD 1146, Edessa was invaded by Turkish Muslims who completely destroyed everything Christian. If the shroud had still been there, it would have been destroyed. In 1204, the shroud survived the Crusader looting and was taken to France by Athens. In AD 1453, Constantinople fell to Muslim Turks and Christianity was erased, but the shroud was now safe in France. In 1532, there was a fire in the Saint Chapelle Chapel at Chambry in France that badly damaged the shroud, giving the burn marks that we now see. However, the image area was not unscathed. This Saint Chapelle Chapel had been specially built to house the shroud. In 1972, an unknown intruder unsuccessfully tried to set fire to the shroud. Another almost successful attempt to destroy the shroud by fire took place in 1997. Thus we see the wonderful providence of God in protecting the shroud. Time does not permit me to tell of the amazing work of Max Fry, a forensic scientist who showed that the shroud had on it pollen grains that could only have come from the area around Jerusalem. I cannot escape the conclusion that the shroud is indeed the linen cloth mentioned in all 4 Gospels. For example, in Mark it says in verse 43 and 46 of Mark 15, Joseph of Arimathea, an honourable counsellor, which also waited for the kingdom of God, came and went in boldly unto Pilate and craved the body of Jesus. And he bought fine linen and took him down and wrapped him in the linen and laid him in a sepulchre which was hewn out of a rock and rolled a stone onto the door of the sepulchre. And he took it down and wrapped it in linen and laid it in a sepulchre that was hewn in stone wherein never man before was laid. Even after the resurrection, the linen cloths do not escape mention. In John chapter 25 to 7, and he stooping down and looking in, saw the linen clothes lying, yet went he not in. Then cometh Simon Peter following him, and went into the sepulchre, and seeth the linen clothes lie, and the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. The shroud agrees in every particular with the details of Christ's crucifixion and burial. Moreover, there is an image imprinted on the shroud which science is at a loss to explain. Did Jesus do this miracle for our benefit? Did he preserve this cloth from destruction down through the centuries to strengthen our faith in these last days of peril and disbelief? To give impetus to the spread of the gospel to all the world? I believe that he did.